This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. In the autumn of 1940, nestled deep within the rugged hills of Newton County, Arkansas, the small community of Jasper seemed untouched by the growing concerns of a world at war. The Ozark Mountains had always been a place where families kept to themselves, where the dense forests and winding hollows provided both shelter and secrecy. It was here, along the winding path of the Buffalo National River, that a series of events would unfold that would haunt the region for decades to come. The first to notice something amiss was Aurelius Whitmore, the local postmaster who had served the scattered homesteads for over 20 years. In his daily rounds through the backwoods trails, Aurelius had developed an intimate knowledge of every family, every routine, every subtle change in the rhythm of mountain life. It was this familiarity that made him acutely aware when letters began accumulating for households that seemed to have simply vanished. The Vandermeer family had lived in a modest cabin overlooking the valley for 3 generations. Zachariah Vandermeer, a stoic man in his 50s, worked a small plot of land with his wife Cordelia, and maintained a modest existence that had remained unchanged for years. When their mail began piling up in October, Aurelius initially assumed they had traveled to visit relatives in Little Rock, as mountain families occasionally did during harsh weather transitions. However, as days turned to weeks and the accumulated letters threatened to overflow his sorting compartments, he decided to make the treacherous journey to their isolated homestead. The cabin stood exactly as it always had, nestled against a backdrop of sugar maples and white oaks that had begun their autumn transformation. The vegetable garden showed signs of recent tending, with rows of winter squash and late tomatoes that appeared to have been harvested systematically. Aurelius knocked repeatedly, calling out familiar greetings, but received no response. The door was unlocked, which was not unusual in this trusting community, and stepping inside revealed a scene of perfect domestic order. The kitchen table was set for 2 place settings, arranged precisely as if expecting dinner guests. A pot of what had once been stew sat on the wood-burning stove, now reduced to a dried, blackened residue that suggested it had been cooking when abandoned weeks earlier. Personal belongings remained untouched in their designated places. Clothing hung neatly in the bedroom wardrobe, and a small stack of money lay openly on the kitchen counter, dispelling any notion of robbery or financial desperation. Most puzzling was the discovery in the front parlor of 2 packed traveling bags, sitting by the door as if their owners had been prepared for departure, but had never completed their journey. Each bag contained carefully folded clothing appropriate for extended travel, along with personal items that no mountain family would leave behind under normal circumstances. Cordelia's Sunday dress, folded with the reverent care reserved for special occasions, lay atop her belongings, while Zachariah's traveling Bible occupied the center compartment of his leather satchel. Aurelius documented what he observed with the methodical precision that had made him an effective postmaster, noting details that would later prove crucial to understanding the broader pattern. The fireplace contained cold ashes that appeared to be several weeks old, confirming his suspicion that the family had been absent for an extended period. More disturbing was the discovery of a hastily written note tucked beneath a coffee cup on the kitchen table, bearing Zachariah's recognizable handwriting, "Gone to meet the requirements, back when obligations fulfilled." The cryptic message provided no clarity about the family's destination or the nature of these mysterious obligations. Aurelius had known Zachariah for 2 decades and had never heard him speak of debts, commitments, or business arrangements that would require sudden departure from his mountain home. The Vandermeers lived a self-sufficient existence that required minimal interaction with outside commerce or legal obligations. After securing the cabin and ensuring that no perishable items would attract unwanted wildlife, Aurelius returned to Jasper with a growing sense of unease. His concerns deepened considerably when he realized that mail was also accumulating for the Thornburg family, who lived approximately 3 miles northeast of the Vandermeer homestead, and the Ashford brothers, bachelor farmers who maintained a larger operation in the adjacent valley. The Thornburg property presented a similar tableau of abandoned domesticity. Virgil Thornburg, a widower who lived with his elderly mother Prudence, had maintained one of the more prosperous farms in the region with a substantial herd of cattle and a well-maintained homestead that reflected years of careful husbandry. Like the Vandermeer cabin, the Thornburg house showed no signs of struggle or hurried departure, yet the inhabitants had clearly been absent for an extended period. In the Thornburg kitchen, Aurelius discovered evidence that the family had been preparing for departure, but with an almost ritualistic attention to detail that seemed inconsistent with ordinary travel plans. The pantry had been systematically emptied, with preserved foods carefully redistributed to neighbors' porches during the night, as evidenced by empty mason jars lined up on the kitchen counter. Fresh milk had been left in containers for the barn cats, suggesting consideration for animal welfare that extended beyond immediate departure. Most intriguingly, Virgil had left a detailed inventory of his livestock and property, along with specific instructions for their care, addressed to no particular recipient, but clearly intended for whoever might discover his absence. The document, written in Virgil's characteristically precise handwriting, concluded with the enigmatic statement, "The arrangement has been made. The price was discussed and accepted. No further negotiation required." The third abandoned property belonging to the Ashford brothers revealed similar patterns of organized departure combined with cryptic references to unspecified arrangements. Silas and Barnabas Ashford, known throughout the region for their insular nature and methodical farming practices, had left their substantial homestead in perfect order, with detailed notes about crop rotation schedules and livestock feeding requirements posted throughout their barn and outbuildings. However, the brothers had also left behind evidence of what appeared to be intensive correspondence in the weeks preceding their disappearance. In a wooden box beneath Silas's bed, Aurelius discovered a collection of letters written in an unfamiliar hand, discussing terms and conditions for what the writer referred to as the regional program and voluntary relocation initiatives. The letters, dated throughout September 1940, mentioned monetary compensation, guaranteed housing arrangements, and assurances about family welfare that would be provided in exchange for cooperation with unspecified government requirements. The correspondence was signed with the initials H.M. Blankhart and included an official-looking letterhead featuring a stylized eagle emblem, though the organization's name was printed in text too small and faded to read clearly. One letter specifically mentioned that participation in the program was entirely voluntary, but stressed the significant financial benefits available to families willing to relocate before the November deadline. The final letter in the collection, dated October 10th, simply stated, "Transportation arrangements finalized. Collection scheduled for October 15th. Bring only essential personal items." Aurelius's discovery of these 3 abandoned homesteads might have been dismissed as an unfortunate coincidence, perhaps related to economic pressures or family emergencies, were it not for what local residents began reporting in the days that followed his investigations. Neighbors throughout the region started acknowledging that they too had noticed unexplained absences, but had assumed that the missing families were visiting relatives or conducting business in larger towns. Bartholomew Kensington, who operated a small general store in Jasper, revealed that several families had made unusual purchases in the weeks preceding their disappearances. Multiple households had bought additional food staples, traveling supplies, and sturdy clothing suitable for extended journeys, but none had mentioned travel plans or explained their sudden need for provisions. More significantly, these families had paid for their purchases with unusually large amounts of cash, displaying more ready money than their typical circumstances would suggest. According to Bartholomew's carefully maintained ledger, the Vandermeers had purchased new traveling clothes along with preserved foods and medical supplies that seemed excessive for their normal requirements. Virgil Thornburg had bought extensive camping equipment, including items that seemed inappropriate for a man his age planning ordinary travel. The Ashford brothers had acquired tools and supplies that Bartholomew characterized as suitable for establishing a new farming operation rather than maintaining their existing homestead. Most intriguingly, all these families had inquired about purchasing items not normally stocked by the general store, specifically requesting heavy-duty rope, canvas tarps, and lanterns designed for extended outdoor use. When Bartholomew had asked about their unusual needs, each family had provided vague explanations about upcoming work projects or hunting expeditions, but their responses had seemed rehearsed and unconvincing. The realization that multiple families had disappeared simultaneously transformed what had initially appeared to be isolated incidents into a coordinated phenomenon that demanded serious investigation. Aurelius contacted the Newton County Sheriff's Office, though he knew that law enforcement resources in the rural Ozarks were limited and often ill-equipped to handle complex investigations involving multiple jurisdictions and missing persons. Sheriff Mordecai Dalton arrived in Jasper 3 days after Aurelius's initial report, accompanied by a deputy and a clerk responsible for documenting their findings. Dalton, a practical man with 2 decades of experience handling mountain disputes and occasional criminal activity, approached the investigation with the methodical skepticism that rural law enforcement required. His initial assumption was that economic pressures had motivated several families to relocate quietly, possibly to avoid debts or legal complications that might have made their departure embarrassing if conducted publicly. However, Dalton's examination of the abandoned homesteads revealed details that challenged simple explanations. The systematic nature of each family's departure, combined with the similar phrasing found in their farewell notes, suggested coordination that seemed unlikely to have developed independently among geographically isolated households. More troubling was the discovery that each abandoned property contained evidence of recent visitors, specifically the presence of cigarette butts bearing unfamiliar tobacco blends and tire tracks from vehicles heavier than typical mountain automobiles. The tire impressions found at each location appeared to have been made by the same vehicle, a truck or large automobile, with distinctive tread patterns that were uncommon in the rural Ozark region. The tracks led from each homestead to the main county road, but disappeared once they reached the harder surface that would not retain clear impressions. This evidence suggested that the missing families had been collected by the same transportation, supporting the theory of coordinated departure rather than independent decisions. Sheriff Dalton's investigation expanded to include interviews with residents throughout Newton County, revealing that the disappearances extended beyond the 3 families initially discovered by Aurelius. Additional homesteads were found abandoned, each displaying similar patterns of organized departure, cryptic farewell messages, and evidence of contact with outside organizers. Within 2 weeks of beginning his investigation, Dalton had documented 9 separate households that had apparently vanished simultaneously, representing more than 25 individuals from one of the most isolated regions of Arkansas. The consistency of the evidence across multiple sites convinced Dalton that the disappearances were related to an organized effort that extended beyond local circumstances. The letters discovered at various homesteads referenced similar terms and conditions, suggesting that families throughout the region had been approached by the same group or organization offering relocation opportunities. However, despite extensive inquiries with state and federal agencies, Dalton was unable to identify any legitimate government program that corresponded to the descriptions found in the correspondence. As autumn progressed into winter, the abandoned homesteads took on an increasingly desolate appearance that emphasized the magnitude of the community loss. Houses that had represented generations of mountain families now stood empty, their windows dark and their chimneys cold, creating a landscape of abandonment that seemed to contradict the natural cycle of rural life. The remaining residents reported feeling unsettled by the silence, where once there had been the familiar sounds of agricultural activity and domestic routine. The psychological impact on the surviving community became apparent as winter deepened and the reality of permanent loss settled over the region. Families who had previously valued their isolation now felt vulnerable and exposed, uncertain whether the circumstances that had led to their neighbors' disappearances might eventually affect their own households. Several remaining families began discussing their own relocation plans, though whether motivated by fear or by knowledge of opportunities similar to those that had attracted their missing neighbors remained unclear. In January 1941, Sheriff Dalton received an unexpected communication that provided the first potential explanation for the mass disappearances. A letter arrived at his office, postmarked from Little Rock, but bearing no return address, containing information that claimed to explain the fate of the missing Newton County families. The letter, typewritten on official-looking letterhead, stated that the families had been relocated as participants in a classified government resettlement program designed to populate strategic regions in preparation for potential wartime requirements. According to the letter, the relocated families were living in new communities, established specifically to support defense-related agricultural and manufacturing initiatives. The program, described as voluntary but confidential, had identified rural families with appropriate skills and backgrounds for relocation to areas where their expertise would contribute to national security objectives. The letter assured Sheriff Dalton that the families were safe, well compensated, and satisfied with their new circumstances, but emphasized that communication with their former communities was prohibited for security reasons. The letter concluded by stating that any further investigation into the relocations would be considered interference with classified government operations and might result in federal charges against local law enforcement officials. It suggested that Sheriff Dalton should close his investigation immediately and advise community members that their missing neighbors had been assigned to important war-related work that required complete confidentiality. A phone number was provided for official verification, though when Dalton attempted to call, he reached a disconnected line. The timing of this communication, arriving months after the disappearances and coinciding with increasing federal government activity related to war preparation, seemed to lend credibility to its claims. Throughout the country, rural communities were experiencing unprecedented government intervention as military bases expanded, defense plants were constructed, and strategic resources were surveyed and allocated. The notion that isolated mountain families might be recruited for specialized agricultural or manufacturing work in support of the war effort was not entirely implausible. However, several aspects of the supposed explanation troubled Sheriff Dalton and seemed inconsistent with legitimate government operations. The secretive nature of the program, the prohibition on any communication between relocated families and their former communities, and the threatening tone of the letter seemed inconsistent with voluntary government programs that he had observed in other contexts. Additionally, the families that had disappeared represented adults of various ages and skill levels that seemed poorly suited for specialized war-related work. Despite his reservations about the letter's authenticity, Sheriff Dalton found himself under pressure from county officials to accept the explanation and close his investigation. The prospect of federal scrutiny and potential charges related to interference with classified operations created political complications that local authorities were reluctant to pursue. Moreover, the ongoing expansion of military activities throughout Arkansas made it reasonable to assume that various secret programs were operating with minimal public disclosure. In February 1941, Sheriff Dalton officially closed his investigation into the Newton County disappearances, filing a final report that accepted the explanation provided in the anonymous letter. His report concluded that the missing families had been relocated as participants in a classified government program, and that further investigation was neither necessary nor appropriate. The case files were sealed and transferred to state authorities, who indicated that they would be maintained as classified materials related to national security activities. For the remaining residents of Newton County, the official closure of the investigation provided little comfort or resolution. The absence of their neighbors continued to create a sense of unease and loss that pervaded daily life in the mountain community. Families who had once felt secure in their isolation now experienced their remoteness as vulnerability. Uncertain whether they might suddenly find themselves targeted for similar relocation efforts. As 1941 progressed and the United States moved closer to active involvement in the global war, the Newton County disappearances gradually faded from local attention, overshadowed by larger national concerns and the practical challenges of wartime life. The abandoned homesteads became overgrown and deteriorated, their empty structures serving as stark reminders of the community that had been lost. New families occasionally moved into the region, but the area never regained the population density or social cohesion that had characterized it before the disappearances. In the decades that followed, the events of 1940 became part of local folklore, with various explanations offered by residents who had not experienced the disappearances directly. Some maintained that the families had indeed been recruited for secret government work and had simply chosen not to return after the war ended. Others suggested that economic desperation had motivated coordinated departure to seek better opportunities in industrial centers that were expanding due to wartime production demands. A more troubling theory, whispered occasionally but rarely discussed openly, suggested that the families had fallen victim to a confidence scheme or criminal organization that had targeted rural communities during the economic uncertainties of the pre-war period. According to this explanation, the families had been lured away by promises of financial opportunities that proved to be fraudulent, resulting in their exploitation or elimination by criminals who understood that isolated mountain communities had limited law enforcement resources. However, proponents of this theory struggled to explain why no evidence of criminal activity was ever discovered, why the families had departed with such systematic organization, or why the supposed criminals had left valuable property and money behind at each abandoned homestead. The absence of any subsequent criminal investigations or prosecutions related to fraud targeting rural communities also seemed to argue against organized criminal involvement in the disappearances. In 1952, more than a decade after the original events, a chance discovery provided new information about the Newton County disappearances that challenged all previous explanations. During construction of a new highway that would improve access to the Ozark region, work crews uncovered a mass burial site approximately 15 miles from Jasper, containing the remains of numerous individuals who appeared to have died during the 1940s. The burial site was located in a remote valley that had no historical connection to any known cemetery or settlement, suggesting that it had been created specifically to conceal the remains. Forensic examination revealed that the bodies had been buried systematically, with careful attention to concealment that indicated knowledge of proper burial techniques designed to prevent discovery. More disturbing was evidence suggesting that the individuals had died violently, though the condition of the remains made it difficult to determine specific causes of death. state authorities took control of the investigation, classifying the discovery as potential evidence in a mass murder case that might be related to organized criminal activity. However, identification of the remains proved difficult due to their deteriorated condition and the limited medical and dental records available for rural mountain families from the 1940s. While some personal items found with the bodies suggested connections to the Newton County disappearances, definitive identification was never established through official channels. The highway construction was temporarily halted while investigators processed the burial site, but after several months without significant progress in identifying victims or determining causes of death, the remains were transferred to a state forensic facility for continued analysis. The construction project resumed, effectively sealing the burial site beneath several feet of asphalt and gravel, making any future investigation extremely difficult and expensive. Local residents who learned about the discovery expressed a mixture of vindication and horror, feeling that their suspicions about the true fate of their missing neighbors had been confirmed while simultaneously confronting the reality that their community had been the victim of mass murder. However, state authorities cautioned that no definitive connection had been established between the remains and the Newton County disappearances, emphasizing that multiple explanations remained possible for both the burial site and the missing families. For Sheriff Dalton, who had returned to Jasper after military service in the Pacific Theater, the discovery of the burial site created personal and professional anguish that would affect him for the remainder of his career. In private conversations with trusted colleagues, he expressed regret about accepting the questionable explanation for the disappearances and closing his investigation prematurely. He suspected that political pressure and fear of federal intervention had prevented him from pursuing leads that might have uncovered the truth about his missing constituents. In 1953, Sheriff Dalton attempted to reopen the investigation into the Newton County disappearances, arguing that the discovery of the burial site provided new evidence that justified renewed attention to the case. However, his request was denied by county officials, who cited the continuing classification of the original case files and concerns about interfering with ongoing state and federal investigations. Dalton was informed that any attempt to conduct independent investigation would be considered insubordination and might result in his removal from office. Frustrated by official obstruction, but unwilling to jeopardize his position, Sheriff Dalton began conducting informal research into the disappearances during his personal time, hoping to gather sufficient evidence to justify a formal reopening of the case. His investigation focused on attempting to verify the authenticity of the anonymous letter that had claimed to explain the family's fate, as well as researching whether any legitimate government programs had operated in Arkansas during 1940 that might correspond to the descriptions provided. Dalton's research revealed significant inconsistencies in the official explanation for the disappearances that strengthened his conviction that the families had been victims of criminal activity rather than participants in government relocation programs. No federal agency acknowledged operating any program that matched the descriptions provided in the anonymous letter, while military officials confirmed that rural families had not been recruited for classified agricultural or manufacturing work in the manner suggested. More significantly, Dalton discovered that several other rural communities throughout Arkansas and neighboring states had reported similar disappearances during 1940 and 1941, suggesting a pattern of criminal activity that extended far beyond Newton County. These communities had received similar anonymous explanations, attributing their missing residents to classified government programs, but subsequent investigation had failed to verify the existence of any such programs or to locate any of the allegedly relocated families. The consistency of these reports across multiple states indicated organized criminal activity that was sophisticated enough to target isolated rural communities, eliminate entire families without leaving obvious evidence of violence, and manipulate local law enforcement through false government credentials and threats of federal intervention. The scope and coordination required for such activities suggested involvement by a criminal organization with substantial resources and knowledge of government operations. However, despite accumulating evidence that supported his suspicions about the true nature of the disappearances, Sheriff Dalton found himself unable to pursue official investigation without cooperation from state and federal authorities, who continued to maintain that the missing families had been relocated for legitimate government purposes. His informal research was hampered by limited access to official records and jurisdictional restrictions that prevented him from investigating activities that had allegedly occurred in other states. As the 1950s progressed and memories of the original disappearances faded, Sheriff Dalton gradually abandoned his efforts to reopen the investigation, recognizing that too much time had passed and too many obstacles existed for effective pursuit of the truth. The surviving residents of Newton County had moved on with their lives, and younger residents had no direct memory of the missing families or investment in resolving their fate. The abandoned homesteads gradually deteriorated and were reclaimed by the forest, their foundations and cleared fields providing the only evidence that families had once lived and worked in locations that returned to wilderness. Occasionally, hunters or hikers would discover remnants of the abandoned properties, but most people avoided the areas due to their association with unexplained disappearances and persistent local folklore about unusual activity. In 1964, nearly a quarter century after the original events, a research team from the University of Arkansas attempted to conduct a comprehensive study of the Newton County disappearances as part of a broader examination of rural population changes during the World War II era. The researchers hoped to access official case files and interview surviving witnesses to develop a definitive account of the events that could either confirm or refute the various theories that had developed over the years. However, the research team encountered the same obstacles that had frustrated Sheriff Dalton's efforts to reopen the investigation. Case files remained classified and inaccessible to civilian researchers, while state and federal agencies declined to provide information about programs that might have been related to the disappearances. Surviving witnesses were reluctant to discuss their memories of the events, either due to advanced age, concerns about privacy, or persistent fears about potential consequences of public disclosure. The university research project was ultimately abandoned after 6 months of investigation that produced minimal new information about the disappearances. The researchers concluded that insufficient evidence remained available to support definitive conclusions about the fate of the missing families, while acknowledging that their limited access to official records prevented comprehensive analysis of the various explanations that had been proposed over the years. The failure of the university research project effectively ended any prospect of future investigation into the Newton County disappearances as academic interest in the case waned and the events became increasingly distant from contemporary concerns. The region continued to develop as transportation infrastructure improved and tourism increased, but the history of the missing families became an obscure footnote in local history that was rarely discussed openly. Today, more than 8 decades after the disappearances, the truth about what happened to the 9 Newton County families remains unknown. Their abandoned homesteads have long since been reclaimed by the forest, while their descendants, if any survived, have never been located despite occasional efforts by amateur historians and genealogy researchers. The official explanation attributing their disappearance to classified government relocation programs has never been verified or disproven, leaving their fate suspended between official acceptance and persistent local skepticism. The discovery of the mass burial site in 1952 provides the most tangible evidence that the missing families may have met violent ends, But the inability to definitively identify the remains or connect them to the Newton County disappearances means that even this discovery raises more questions than it answers. The systematic concealment of the burial site suggests criminal activity, but the absence of identified perpetrators or clear motives leaves the case permanently unresolved. For the modern residents of Newton County, the events of 1940 represent a dark chapter in local history that illustrates the vulnerability of isolated rural communities to exploitation by forces beyond their understanding or control. Whether those forces were criminal organizations, government agencies, or some other entity entirely may never be known, but the comprehensive disappearance of 9 families serves as a reminder that even in modern times, people can vanish completely, leaving behind only empty homes and unanswered questions. The Ozark Mountains continue to harbor secrets in their remote valleys and hidden hollows, places where families once built lives that connected them to the land and to each other across generations. In those quiet spaces, the absence of voices that should still be echoing through the hills creates a silence that speaks more powerfully than any investigation or explanation ever could about the fragility of human presence in a landscape that endures long after its people have disappeared. Some mysteries resist resolution, regardless of how much time passes or how many questions are asked. The Newton County disappearances of 1940 stand as testament to the enduring power of the unknown, a reminder that in a world that seems increasingly transparent and connected, there remain corners where darkness persists and answers refuse to emerge. The empty cabins may have crumbled back into the earth, but the questions they represent continue to haunt the mountain hollows where families once lived and loved and vanished without a trace.